from a favorite author, Florence King. This is the last two pieces in Withering Slights, the Bent Pin Collection, 2007 to 2012, the complete unabridged collection. So it's a collection in the title twice. Anyway, let's read these last two. February 6, 2012, Mr. Hitchens and I. Christopher Hitchens and I were not friends or even acquaintances. We never met or spoke on the phone, just exchanged occasional brief letters, notes really, handwritten and snail-mailed at first, emailed later. I suppose the most colloquial name for our relationship is pen pals, but that is much too hearty and well-adjusted for either of the difficult personalities involved. It reeks of reaching out. My description of what we shared comes from the imagery that Longfellow called ships that pass in the night. Our first pass occurred in the 80s, when we were both weekday book reviewers on Newsday. I think I was Tuesday and he was Wednesday. The book page staff took to betting on which of us would come up with the most devastating comment on a bad book. The results were passed on to us by the book editor, the late Nina King. Just about everybody I used to know is now the late. While Hitchens and I, voicing suitably modest disclaimers, would tell Nina our favorite lines from each other's reviews, which she would then pass on to us. This strikes me as significant now, that Nina slipped so naturally into the role of go-between seems to hint that even then the fates had decided that he and I would never meet. Hitchens went on to bigger and better devastations, attacking religion in general and Mother Teresa in particular, while I went on to National Review. It was the least likely place to bring us back together, but in a way that's where it happened. One of my last Misanthrope's Corner columns before my premature retirement in 2002 was about my experience in blurbing books. I related my best blurbing stories and ended with a confession. The writer I would most like to blurb is Christopher Hitchens, and I've already written the blurb. If Christopher Hitchens is a Marxist, I want to be one too. That broke the ice. He wrote me a thank-you note, and our occasional correspondence began. We always addressed each other as Miss King and Mr. Hitchens, our symbolic, but never spelled out, loathing for the hang-loose world we both occupied. It was better that way. We said more by saying nothing. I was glad that we always kept things short. If we had written real letters, I would eventually have gone on too long about my Anglophilia, but one of our brief exchanges brought it out naturally. I asked him if he knew the words to an old music hall song my father used to sing, about an undernourished baby having a bath. He did, and dashed off the Cockney lyrics. I think I won't even try anything like a Cockney or British accent here. Your baby has gone down the plug hole. Your baby has gone down the plug. The poor little thing was so skinny and thin, he ought to have been washed in a jug. Your baby is perfectly happy. He don't need no washing no more. Your baby has gone down the plug hole. Not lost, just gone before. We almost met once, but the opportunity came at the worst possible time. A few years ago he wrote that he had a speaking engagement down my way, and suggested that we have a drink together. Anything less than the truth would have sounded like an excuse, so I told him the truth. I just got out of the hospital, and I feel and look like hell. He understood, and we agreed to aim for another time. "I need somebody to sneer with," I wrote, "and they're so hard to find." He replied, "If you ever feel like collectivizing the sneers, I am within bowl's roar of you and at your service." The question of meeting never did come up again. It was up to me to suggest another occasion, but I never did. I forget what reason I gave myself, but looking back, I think fate was at it again. If we had met, particularly with alcohol in the mix, we would have talked the hind legs off a mule, but no matter how intellectually satisfying it might have been, it would have brought about a change that I hated to think about. We could never again write those terse little notes, never again be ships that pass in the night. Holding back has become the last remaining art form in 21st century America, and Hitchens and I had perfected something that I did not want to give up. To do so would be to join the marauding armies of equal time, the buzzing swarms of twitters and tweeters who fill the nation's computer screens with their acronym droppings and call it communicating. The screenwriters who stuff movies with so much unnecessary dialogue that it confuses what little plot there is. And the verbal bricklayers who write 10,000-page congressional bills that nobody reads before passing. Brevity used to be regarded as the soul of wit, but in America it identifies a rapidly multiplying segment of the population with a 3-word vocabulary consisting of surreal, awesome, and cool. My last note to Hitchens before he died was about the royal wedding. "Did you watch Drooping the Colour this weekend?" I asked. He replied, "I did hazard a glimpse of it. Was there anybody there higher than the rank of Sir Elton and Beckham? It looked low rent even by showbiz standards. In Oliver Cromwell's funeral cortege, there walked John Milton, John Dryden, and Andrew Marvell." I'm pleased to say that the blurb I wanted to give him, "If Christopher Hitchens is a Marxist, I want to be one too," actually did appear in an ad for one of his books. Some people believe he is now in heaven, others that he is now in hell, but I have the skinny on this controversy. He is in the sea lane next to mine. March 5th, 2012. Something Ere the End. As a believer in writing a good lead, I should begin this column with a light-hearted description of the so-called farewell concerts of Sir Harry Lauder and Anna Russell that went on for years. But I just don't feel like it. I'm in no mood to riff and quip, so I'll just say straight out that this is my last bent pin. Two factors come into play here, both equally depressing. The first is my incompatibility with the genre itself. A columnist in a political magazine might normally be expected to write about politics, at least sometimes, but whenever I did, the results were strained, and frequently depended for their point on some ancient ruler. I think I even dragged Vercingetorix. Into one of them. It's late and I'm not looking it up. After my convoluted attempt to cite the Segway scooter as a sign of our times, I avoided politics and took refuge in what is called Culture Watch. I wrote a lot about old movies, a solid ground for me, because I was born at the ideal time to remember the Golden Age classics. When the Tea Party discovered the political Ayn Rand, I wrote about the literary Ayn Rand. When adultery reared its head in the South Carolina governor's mansion, I wrote about Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. Show me a political issue, and I'll show you a way to avoid writing about it. This method worked for me for some time, But all good ruses come to an end, and mine came when America started gearing up for election 2012. Maybe it was the endless hours spent watching the Jacobins on MSNBC. Maybe it was switching to CNN and finding cyberspacey John King, the high-tech finger painter, noodling his living maps. Whatever it was, I was trapped in a cycle of revulsion, resignation, and exhaustion that became unbearable. It was the cri de coeur time, and out it came. I hate politics. I'm sick of everybody, on both sides. Whether it's Obama making a fool of himself singing at the Apollo Theater, or the whole nit gomni sanctus sanctorum omnium gatherum on the right. My conservatism is philosophical, not political, and by philosophical, I mean T.S. Eliot and Irving Babbitt, not Ron Paul. My conservatism is literary. When Gingrich called Spanish the language of the ghetto, I did not calculate the number of Hispanic voters in this or that state. My only thought was, Spanish is the language of Cervantes and Lope de Vega. And truth be told, my conservatism is elitist. In one of my books I wrote, democracy is the crude leading the crud. I used to express such sentiments regularly, but in today's tense political atmosphere, with both parties set on hair-trigger hysteria, jocular is the new jugular. Nobody like me could expect to be a mainstream columnist and last very long, but that's not all that's wrong. The other depressing reason for packing in the bent pin is something I hinted about in my column on famous last words. I don't think I'm going to live much longer. I haven't been well since my hospitalization 3 years ago, and I'm getting worse. But I refuse to exhaust myself, going from test to test, specialist to specialist, and treatment to treatment, just for the dubious privilege of prying 3 or 4 more years out of fate. I'm 76, and I have decided, come what may, to let fate decide. Some of you, aware of my agnosticism, have written that you pray for me. You will be happy to know that I pray now, too, though you may find my choice of deities eccentric. I have canonized my own patron saint, my paternal grandmother, the one I never knew, who died before my father came to America. Born Florence Hart in Belfast, she went to London and found work as a maid in a private home. She was supposed to dust the piano, but she lingered over it long enough to learn to pick out tunes. Caught in the act, she was fired and drifted to the East End, where she met and married a Cockney named George King, who called her Florrie. She found another piano in her favorite pub and taught herself to play. They hired her as the entertainment for a few shillings and all the gin she could drink, which was quite a lot. She often took my father with her and stashed him under the piano. He said his earliest memory was watching her foot in its high-buttoned shoe, tapping out the beat. When she died in the early 1920s, he found a pile of empty gin bottles under her bed. As a child, I was strangely enchanted at seeing my own name on my father's birth certificate. The same sensation came over me last year when I fell in the kitchen and couldn't get up. Everything solid enough to pull myself up was either too high or too low. As I lay there wondering what to do, I started to pray. Granny Florrie, they say the Lord helps those who help themselves, so please help Florence King get up. After a moment, I remembered the iron railing on the back steps. Crawling out the kitchen door, I grabbed hold of it. It was just the right height. An ego-driven epiphany, perhaps, but I've been praying to her ever since. My most fervent prayer is, please let me die in the saddle. A writer must write. Writing is oxygen. A real writer is driven to write as long as it is mentally and physically possible. I am pleased to report that I will continue getting my fix from National Review, my favorite supplier. I'll be in the literary section, reviewing books. I hope you like them. Paul Greenberg certainly does. In his introduction to my latest National Review book, he said, "My favorite part of this collection may be the book reviews." And just in case I literally die in the saddle, I am sending NR an essay on a literary subject to keep on hold to fill up the space left by an unfinished review. I'm sending it today, in fact. I've never missed a deadline in my life, and I'm not going to start now. That was Florence King, who I discovered when I used to read National Review 20 or more years ago. Her column was called The Misanthrope's Corner, and she left and came back and then called it The Bent Pin. And thank you for listening and hopefully enjoying.